Welcome to AlgeBridge, a guide for teachers. This program is designed for Math 6 students that would like to accelerate and take Math 7th pre-AP in the fall. Here's the agenda for the session today. We'll first talk about the rationale, and some of the resources that you may want to pull up in an additional tab would be the presentation, the pacing guide, profile sheet, and the spot checks. Once those are opened in a new tab, we'll take a look at the deeper dive into the lessons. This year's 6th graders were last year's 5th graders. And based on the data, there are approximately 1,000 6th graders that did not track into the pre-AP that were probably ready. This course is designed for those students as well as other 6th grade students that may have had a breakout year and would be ready for the pre-AP track. Currently, the only opportunity for 6th graders to take pre-AP is at the beginning of the year. This program allows them one more on-ramp into the pre-AP track and be on track to take algebra in 8th grade. This is the pacing guide for the 8 days. Keep in mind that each day you'll need 3 hours of instruction, so approximately 180 minutes per day. There are quite a few links that you can access as well from this view. Day 1 is going to be rational number operations. Day 2 and Day 3 is going to be constant rate of change, as well as a few supporting standards. Day 4 through 6 will focus on ratios, rates, and percents, as well as a few supporting standards that incorporate financial literacy. And then the last 2 days will be equations and inequalities. There are a few do-nows that are already identified. You'll focus on 4 main readiness standards that will be identified in red. The green are your supporting standards, and the black text indicates any prior knowledge and vertical alignment from the 6th grade TEK to the 7th grade TEK. There will be a student profile sheet that you'll check off at the end of each set of days. Notice Day 1 has 3 standards. Day 2 and 3 has a series of 5 standards. Then you'll see days 4 through 6 and days 7 through 8. This is the student documentation that will follow their CUME folders, that they were proficient in these standards. Let's take a deeper look at Day 1. Rational number operations. The do now is simply an extension of their previous knowledge. There are a few links for the visual representation and the lesson that's correlated from Go Math. The readiness standards will be in red, supporting standards in green, and prior knowledge, vertical alignment information will be in black. (7.2a) for their do now is very similar to their 6th grade standard. You'll simply focus on explaining the relationships between the sets and subsets. In order to accomplish these standards in one day, one suggestion is to break this into 2 90-minute lesson cycles. You can group lesson 1.3 and 1.4 from Go Math, which is the addition and subtraction. And then you can group the multiplication and division, which is 1.5 and 1.6. If you would like to, you can further subdivide them into each 45-minute sections. Since sixth graders have already had to multiply, subtract, multiply, and divide integers, the focus here is really on the rational numbers. Sixth graders have already multiplied and divided positive rational numbers, so you want to include multiplying and dividing with negative rational numbers and build the rules that are associated. Let's take a deeper look at day 1. The Go Math modules start with adding rational numbers with the same sign, then adding rational numbers with different signs, finding the additive inverse, and adding three or more rational numbers. Focusing on the titles, you may bundle these lessons, not that you have to go through them each individually. Those are your teacher decisions. Then lesson 1.4 with subtracting is subtracting positive rational numbers and then subtracting negative rational numbers. Go Math sometimes will have cognitive strategies that can be very helpful. Notice here that all of the adding and subtracting are using number lines. That will be the tool that will help with your consistency in your lesson. The second 90-minute lesson would focus on multiplying and dividing. For multiplying, you're going to multiply rational numbers with different signs, then multiplying rationals with the same signs. Again, Go Math suggests using the number line as their tool. Then extending to more than two rational numbers. When dividing rational numbers, you're going to focus on the placement of the negative sign, whether the negative on a fraction is with the numerator or the denominator, or on the outside of the fraction, they still result in the same quotient. Again, you'll build the rules. I would suggest putting these as anchor charts. Hopefully students will see that the rules for dividing rational numbers are the same as for dividing integers. There also is an additional resource here from Region 18 where you can add in some task cards at the end of the lesson. Simply click the image. It's now time to pause the video. Switch to the tab where you had your Google form and answer question number 1 based on day 1. When you're finished answering the question, resume the video. Now let's look at day 2 and day 3, which will focus on constant rate of change. Notice the do now is also incorporating some personal financial literacy. The readiness standard is constant rate of change. Students have already had to represent y equals kx or y equals x plus b and identify the relationship as multiplicative or additive, and identify and write equations from tables and graphs. You will extend that knowledge to match the 7th grade TEK. We will also use rates of change to convert and determine an average hourly wage needed for a family. For day 2, I would suggest breaking up. Most of these days you're going to want to break them up into 2 90-minute lesson cycles. The first 90-minute lesson cycle would focus on constant rate of change. Those of you familiar with Go Math may notice that we're not incorporating lesson 2.1, which is unit rate. You're going to incorporate the concept of unit rate in the lesson with constant rate of change. What you'll notice here is that the constant rate of change isn't done in a table, and that's where we'll be able to identify the unit rate in each instance. We will need to be able to write an equation that represents the relationship. Students should notice that when there's a constant rate of change, it's multiplicative. Go Math also has some math background portions where one variable is a constant of the other, y equals kx. We won't be bringing it up in these lessons, but just to make a note that the constant k is calculated to be the slope of the line when we get to graphing. This lesson will focus on the use of ratio tables. Notice whenever one of the units is 1, that's where we'll identify our unit rate, and then being able to write the equation y equals kx, and also determine k, the value for just k. How is that determined? By representing it as a fraction, y over x, in each case in the table. For the second lesson on day 2, we'll look at converting between measurement systems. In one example, Kate ran 5 miles. How far did she run in kilometers? So 5 miles equals how many kilometers? In using a ratio table, we'll use the concept of the unit rate, that 1 mile is equal to 1.61 kilometers, and build the table up to 5. Second example, Alex filled a 5-gallon jug. Again, we're using 5, but it's simply converting customary to metric and metric to customary. Using the concept of the unit rate again. You will need a copy of your formula chart as well. And think about representing your formula chart as unit rates, that every conversion on the formula chart is a unit rate because they're telling us that 1 foot equals, or 1 yard equals, or 1 mile equals. And so if we get used to using that term unit rate, that might help as well with the kids' understanding of building on a unit rate. Let's take a look at day 3. Day 3, we're going to be bringing in the multiple representations. And we're going to be graphing the proportional relationships. So from the table, building the coordinates, your x and y coordinates, and graphing them. Go Math will also address being a non-example of proportional relationships. That can you tell from a table whether it is or is not proportional? What are the types of multiple representations? Here's one example of a family that drives 7 hours every day. There's a pictorial, a tabular, a graphical, the algebraic, numeric. Numeric is very similar to the tabular, but now we're actually showing the process involved in how the hours is dependent upon the days. and then the verbal representation. We must insert the multiple representations in order to address the TEK properly. Again, here's a resource from Region 18 that click the image in the corner to access the document. It's a multiple representations puzzle. For day 3, the second half, calling it 3B, your second lesson cycle, we're going to be addressing the concept of an average hourly wage. Now, there is some other teaching going on with this, but we are going to be bringing it back around to the concept of a unit rate. So in planning a budget, we will need to talk about expenses, income, and what wage is needed to sustain the monthly expenses. Here's a blank table that brings you down to the necessary monthly income. In order to wrap it back around to the concept of a unit rate, we'll add in the extra row at the bottom to get an hourly wage or hourly rate, which is your unit rate. Once we determine the hourly rate, you can also connect it back with the different multiple representations from the first half of the day. That's the conclusion of day 2 and 3. Before we move on to the next set of days, remember to refer back to the student profile sheet. You don't want to wait until the end of the 8 days to try to check off proficiency. It's now time to pause the video again. Switch to your tab that has the Google form and answer question number 2 based on days 2 and 3 from the video. Then restart your video. When we get to days 4, 5, and 6, this is the largest bulk of your 8 days. Day 4 will be converting measurements and also budgets with percents attached to a personal budget. Day 5 will be percentage of changes, including interest, and then day 6 will incorporate taxes and purchasing decisions. We're incorporating quite a few of the personal financial literacy TEKs, especially the ones that can be done that involve ratios, rates, and percents. Your do now in this case is a linear relationship of the week. This will help reinforce what you just taught with day 2 and day 3 and multiple representations. You won't complete all of the sections in one day. You may only get through it once over the course of the 3-day period. As you can see, there are a lot of Go Math modules in this section. We're going to talk about how you can piece those together because you won't have time to go through each lesson by themselves. There are multiple methods to solve ratios, rates, and percents. There's a percent bar, hundreds grid, strip diagrams, number lines, dimensional analysis, and scale factors, to name a few. Beginning with conversions for day 4, again splitting this up into 2 90-minute lesson cycles. Conversions with proportions. The TEK is actually the conversions through the use of unit rates or proportions. We've already looked at converting through unit rates. Now we're going to look at how we convert using proportions. We're going to take a look at the same example from day 2, where Kate ran 5 miles, and how do you convert that to kilometers. Instead of using a ratio table, we're going to use a percent bar or a proportion bar. In this case, you would set up your bar with your one unit on the top bar, one unit on the bottom side of the bar. It's very similar to a double number line. You don't have to have the zeros, but it's easy for kids to identify that 0 miles would be equivalent to 0 kilometers. Using our unit rate from the formula chart, 1 mile is the same as 1.61 kilometers. So when looking at what is 5 miles, instead of building the ratio table from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we're just going to go straight from 1 to 5. Now our missing value is x, what is 5 miles equivalent to in kilometers. When we use a proportion bar, in setting it up, it can be horizontal or vertical. In this case, I used horizontal. Your proportions are set up for you as soon as you label your proportion bar. 1 in the numerator, 1.61 in the denominator. Then that's equivalent to 5 in your numerator and x in your denominator. Solving with cross products would get you your final answer. Let's look at the second example, where Alex filled a 5-gallon jug. In this case, we would have gallons on top, liters on the bottom, or that could even be flipped. If somebody put liters on top and gallons on the bottom, then your proportions would just be inverted. So your ratios, proportions from there, would be 1 over 3.79 equals 5 over x. And again, then using cross products to solve. The second half of day 4 would be looking at personal budget and the percentages that are attached to personal budgets. You'll have to address income and expenses, fixed expenses, and variable expenses. And in a table, you can identify them simply just with some check marks of fixed and variable expenses. But once you have your household expenses, the TEK to be completely taught has to be represented in a circle graph to show percentages. Well, this can also be done using a proportion bar. An example of using one proportion bar, so you don't have to set up a proportion for each comparison. We're using one bar where the income was $4,000. That represents 100% of the budget. And then breaking it down into $1,400 is the housing cost, represented with the H. $600 represents medical, and it also represents food, labeled F and M. Then the $400 per month expense is labeled as T for transportation, and so on. So you only need one bar, and then you can represent all of your values within that one bar. Then you would set up your proportions from here, as we did in the previous example. Let's take a look at day 5. Day 5 is going to focus on percents. There's a percent increase, a percent decrease, using a percent change, we're also going to incorporate percents in the form of a markup or a markdown. Notice the use of the bar model even in Go Math. and then at calculating the markdown, either in terms of a dollar amount or a percentage. Keep in mind in the math background section that the percent change is compared to the original amount. For example, the percent increase from 10 to 15 is not the same as the percent decrease from 15 to 10. Your original amount is different in each case. Now let's take a look at day 5B, the second half of day 5. Still looking at percents, but this is where we take a little bit of a different look at percents. We're going to have to look at simple and compound interest during this 90-minute lesson. Using the star reference chart, the formulas for simple and compound interest are already here. Start with calculating simple interest. Simple interest is going to be based on really a proportion bar concept, that for every $100, if the interest rate is 5%, as it is in this example, putting it into a verbal description, there's a 5% interest for every $100. Then calculating compound interest, we know students are challenged when it comes to simple and compound interest. So keeping in mind the similarities and differences between them, so notice here that you'll compare simple, compound, the questioning strategy, as I mentioned, how much did Roberto earn for every $100 would be $5. The percent becomes a little more real. Something to consider, the math background, the difference between simple and compound interest. For multi-years, you're including the interest on the next year's calculations. Now for day 6. Day 6, we'll look at taxes again through the lens of a percent, or I should say percent again through the lens of taxes. Calculating sales tax. Most students have seen where what they're being charged at the store is more than what the product actually costs. That's where sales tax comes in. We'll need to take that a little bit further. Calculate withholdings. If you want to include this or break this up into a separate 45-minute lesson, that is completely your choice as a teacher. Then calculating income tax. There are situations where students will have to calculate based on a table what the amount of the tax is, and then have to find what is that percentage of that tax. Again, you can use a percent bar or proportion bar for that. Excuse me. So really, day 2 through day 6 can be taught through the use of a proportion bar. Having a consistent tool or consistent method will help with your timing, your pacing, and kids will get multiple opportunities to practice. Let's finish up with day 6 on purchasing decisions. All the percents that we've been discussing and learning the last few days, now students will have to make some purchasing decisions. Decisions can be used on using a unit price. Again, this can be done using a proportion bar. For example, if they know what the cost of 24 ounces is, then they can use the proportion bar to scale it down to just what's the cost of 1 ounce. This is where you'll have to introduce rebates and coupons as well, and how sales, rebates, and coupons are calculated differently. We have sales, rebates, and we have coupons. Sales can be in the form of a percent. Rebates is a certain dollar off after the purchase is made in most cases. And then a coupon is not a percentage off, but a set amount off, usually with a minimum purchase required. Ratios, rates, and percents also has a scavenger hunt from Region 18. When you click on the image, it'll take you to the document for a scavenger hunt. This would be culminating at the end of your 3 days of ratios, rates, and percents. Don't forget to revisit your student profile at the end of these 3 days to check off for student proficiency. It's now time to pause the video once again, switch over to your Google form and answer question number 3, which is based on days 4 through 6 from the video. Then come back to the video and resume. Now let's finish up by looking at our days 7 and 8, equations and inequalities. Your due now is a routine called equations and inequalities that will kind of bring together all the different representations and ways to look at the equations and inequalities. You may want to use that template as you're teaching the lesson for the day. Remember, students have already modeled, solved, and written one variable, one-step equations and inequalities. So you're adding now for the 7th grade TEKS is the second step, where you're combining their additive and multiplicative. One suggestion is to use day 7 for equations, and then day 8 would be inequalities. If your students are showing proficiency early on day 7 with equations, then go ahead and go into your inequalities. That'll save you some time on day 8 in order to do some other activities. Now with equations, students have to write, model, solve, and represent solutions on a number line, as well as being able to tell if a given value makes the equation true. So there are a lot of verbs, a lot of things that students have to do with these equations. They'll have to write 2-step equations. Notice here they're modeling with the use of algebra tiles, so break out your algebra tile kits. They're going to have to write a verbal description of the equation, where they're given an equation, Then once they model the equation, they'll have to solve, again using algebra tiles. Then represent that solution on a number line. I don't necessarily see these lessons as being in isolation, so you may want to bundle these as you're working through an equation. That's why I recommended you could use the template from the Do Now, because it incorporates all of those different verbs: writing, modeling, solving, and the number line. And then determine if a given value makes an equation true. Once you represent the solution on a number line, then you can talk about some of the other values that are on the number line and whether they make that equation true or not. Again, Region 18 has a card set that goes with equations, depending on how your timing is going. Now this day 7, this is your 180 minutes. We're not dividing this out into 2 separate lessons. So your pacing, you may have time to do the card set. Then with day 8, you're going to have to accomplish the same verbs: write, model, solve, and represent on a number line. But instead of equations, now you're going to have inequalities. Again, if they progress through equations on day 7, you might start your inequalities on day 7 if you have time. Using the algebra tiles, you're going to model, write the verbal description. Now, since students have looked at equations and inequalities, they can compare and contrast how solving equations is similar or different than solving inequalities. Solving using algebra tiles, and interpreting those solutions on a number line. As we know, the inequalities gets a little more sticky, if you will, when representing inequalities on a number line. Now we've got to introduce whether it's a closed circle or an open circle, depending on whether it's greater than or equal to, and how it represents any value from that point, either greater or less than, would satisfy the inequality. So now you've got multiple solutions as opposed to just one solution. You can also wrap back around your answers on a number line, your solutions on a number line, to classifying your rational numbers. Sort of close that day 1 loop now on day 8. You can pick some other values on the number line and show how to determine if that value makes the inequality true. Region 18 has another set of task cards with solving your 2-step inequalities. Simply click the image as like the others. That wraps up your day 8. Not yet. There is a task also that's associated with 2-step inequalities, the sports equipment set. Click on the link in order to view the task. And something that was also included on the other days, you may or may not have time for, but it's just simply some more options for you as to some of the tasks that are involved with the other lessons, the other readiness standards. Now we'll just take a minute to close out the informational session. Again, look at your student document. Finish that out now that you're done with day 8. That will need to go with the student's CUME folder. You might want to give the student a copy of that as a completion. And last but not least, pause your video for one last time, switch to your Google form, and complete question number 4, which is based on days 7 and 8 from the video. Please make sure you submit your form at the end of question number 4. So in conclusion, if you have any questions or concerns, please email or call me. My name is Jackie Malone. I'm the middle school math coordinator. My email is jmalone@dallasisd.org, and my phone number is listed on the slide. A few notes. This is simply a suggested pacing and sequencing. Based on your students, as I've already mentioned, you may finish some lessons earlier, you may need a little bit more time for others, so you can work out that wiggle room. Many of the days you're going to have like a lesson A and a lesson B in order to help you chunk your time, because the 3 hours can be a lot. I've referenced Go Math, I've referenced some tasks, and I've referenced some Region 18 activities. These are district resources for Go Math and the tasks. Feel free, if you have additional resources that are on your campus that you prefer to substitute with, as long as you're completing the entire TEK. It's not necessarily about finishing all of these lessons. It's about teaching to the aligned standards. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, please reach out to me.